If history is a reliable guide to Afghanistan's future as a well-governed nation state at peace with itself, then we have to be honest that it doesn't bode too well. There are too many striking parallels to ignore where the withdrawal of occupying forces and subsidies have exposed a vacuum too deep to fill. 30 years ago, the Soviet Union began withdrawing its forces from Afghanistan. And over a century before Russian troops were pulled out, the British attempted to secure their foothold behind a line of control, the Durand Line. This caused the Emir of Afghanistan, Abdurrahman Khan, to write to the British Viceroy of India, expressing his concerns about the risk of withdrawal and imposition of a new border. If you should cut the frontier tribes out of my dominions, he wrote, they will neither be of use to you nor to me. You will always be engaged in fighting or other trouble with them, and they will always go on plundering. In your cutting away from me these tribes, you will injure my prestige in the eyes of my subjects, and that will make me weak, and my weakness is injurious for your government. Khan's letter to Lord Lansdowne, written in 1893, still carries a chilling threat.
What kind of peace are we looking for? We call it a dignified and lasting peace, but what does that mean? Like, I think we can translate that into a peace where any Afghan is able to vote without fear or without any discrimination. Again, with the question that is asked for this forum, who will really govern Afghanistan? Whoever governs Afghanistan, it's really important that we make sure that the country is driven by the interests of the people of Afghanistan.
The government wants a ceasefire as soon as possible, and typically the let's say the insurgent group does not. They feel that giving up on fighting would deprive them of a major weapon against the government. Also, I should also mention that ceasefires that are not monitored and seriously monitored by a neutral third party are unlikely to last. At the end of the day, I think that one has to plan for a verification of the final agreement. Now, that's a bit long term, because I don't think that we're going to see an agreement anytime soon. So I continue to believe that it would be in the interest of the two sides and in the interest of the third parties if the United Nations were to deploy a mediator who would cover not only the intra-Afghan dialogue, but also would take into account the interest of the neighboring countries.
And if I take you quickly back to the history of aid dependency in Afghanistan, we all know that since the time of Emir Abdurrahman Khan, when serious state building was considered for Afghanistan, particularly institution building, Afghanistan relied on outside sources, financial sources. At that time, the British Empire was funding Afghanistan's state building through Indians. At that time, India was, of course, under the colony. So historically speaking, the issue of state building in Afghanistan was always funded by external resources. And while in the process, investing money on this country, which had its own self-governed form of governance, but with the help of the external supports, the priority was given on ways of governance in a state building that was more important to external forces as opposed to building internal systems. For example, something that historically no one really worked much on, and I can argue even now, is the issue of taxation and how that could be tackled from the very beginning. As a result, we remained more like a rentier state, sponsored and supported by different global powers, and that is also not an exemption in the last 4 decades of our history of wars and invasions. With the Soviet invasion, the funding came from the USSR of the time, from the Soviets from one side, and of course the other opponents funded the Mujahideen forces. And over the fall of the pro-Soviet regime, we had, I will not take you to the history, but to look at it, historically, aid dependency has been part of Afghanistan's modern or contemporary identity.
I feel that the media, the Western media in particular, is guilty of looking at the situation through a very particular prism. And there's a very particular narrative, and I find it very, very limited. I think when one looks more widely at issues, for a start, I would say that the 9/11 is an absolute linchpin issue that needs to be deeply assessed. It hasn't been properly investigated. And of course, 9/11 is the reason, we are told, that we went into the war in Afghanistan, that the invasion of Afghanistan, essentially by the US and NATO, took place in 2001, in October 2001. And yet that's never discussed, it's never brought up. But yet, when I was living in New York in the last few years, I came across architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and there seemed to be some very, very serious issues with the official story of 9/11 that are never aired. And I think it's important to contextualize this when we're looking at a war that has now gone on for 20 years, has cost trillions of dollars, looks to have no end and no exit, and no sustainability really in terms of how are Afghans going to get onto their feet in the future? How are they going to be able to start to self-sustain? And obviously it's particularly difficult with not just the situation where you have competing powers around Afghanistan, all with their own interests, but where you have a narrative which I feel is very, very limited with the prism through which we're looking at these things. And just to give some examples, I would say that we need to look at the drugs trade more honestly. We need to look at the military-industrial complex and its role in the Afghan war and perpetuating the war much more honestly. We need to look at as I've just said, 9/11 needs to be properly investigated. We need to look at who's funding Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Although it has been very slow and the progress is not as significant as all of us are expecting, but still it's a step forward. And at least the willingness that is coming from the government and as well as from the Taliban side, and the attention and the support that's coming not only from the international partners and allies that we have, but also from the Islamic and neighboring countries, encouraging both sides for the peace process. I see that as a major step forward, and I see that as an opportunity for all of us to work through and make sure that this time we seize it properly, and we seize it to respond to the needs of Afghan people, and rather as the concern and challenges of the Afghan people, rather than coming up with our own aspirations and trying to paint that what kind of Afghanistan every partner would like to have as in the long run. So that's a step forward. And then secondly, one thing that should be really important for us is the Taliban. I personally believe that we have overestimated and overrated Taliban when it comes to Afghanistan conflict. Afghanistan has been in conflict in the last 4 decades. Yes, Taliban are into existence for more than like 2 decades or 2.5 decades, but we did have conflict even before the existence of Taliban.
There's a lot of resistance at the community level. So communities in Nuristan and Kandahar coming out and resisting both corrupt officials at the village, at district level, but they're also resisting the Taliban in areas. People have come out, and in a recent example of Kandahar is fascinating when the Alakozai tribe collectively went to the Taliban and asked the Taliban not to attack, to withdraw from the district, their entire operation, because it was the pomegranate season. So you'll also see a lot of resistance to the Taliban and areas that people have preferred some sort of a self-governance, including some form of justice mechanism, justice service delivery for themselves, and that gives us an interesting indication of the possibility of exploring those sort of bottom-up approach to developing the future political system.
If I were going on a doorstep as a politician, I would be saying, this is what I can offer you. This is what you and I can build together as a community. And it seems to me that the original challenge of this seminar today was the future governance and the future of Afghanistan. Who will govern and what will it be like?